everyone, and welcome to another WWF Expert Q&A. I'm very excited to be here this evening with my lovely colleague Veronica.
Thank you.
My name's Mary. We'll do introductions in a minute, give everybody a chance to find us. So our Q&A this evening is all about trees and forests, which is one of me and Veronica's absolutely favourite topics. We're both, I think I would say, massive tree huggers.
Yes, we are.
I feel like I'm comfortable saying that. So the title of the Q&A we're going to have this evening is how can we stop deforestation and restore our forests around the globe? So Veronica, both you and me worked on our big, beautiful global forest pathways report recently. But we were talking in that report about this real kind of crisis point that our forests are at. But we both look at very different bits of this big, broad profile of forest work that goes on here at WWF. So before we move on to questions, I thought maybe we'd do some introductions and tell people what we do here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm going to talk, I guess, about the science work and then hand over and we'll talk about the bigger picture stuff as well. So my name's Mary Gagen, and I work in the science team here at WWF UK. So looking at the broader scientific evidence, I guess, for how our forests are being impacted by climate change and all of the different threats and drivers of deforestation, and how that kind of comes together to the picture of deforestation that we see now. So I'm a scientist by background, and Veronica, you look at a different but super important area as well.
Yeah, so very nice to meet you. I am Veronica, and I am the Global Deforestation and Conversion Free on our supply chains agenda in WWF International, which, as Mary says, is a key agenda for our organization, and is making sure that we are working on the transformation of our food systems and making more sustainable our consumption and production patterns, which is a key thing if we want to restore the forest and the other ecosystems that we are living in.
So I think one of the things that was very clear to me when I joined WWF, I'm a slightly newer panda, more recent panda, was how much work there is that goes on around how connected what's happening in our forests are to our food system. So it might be a surprise to some of our folks watching. So we're going to talk about that a bit more later on. Actually, because we spend quite a lot of time talking about trees, actually, I'm just going to go ahead and say that. So while we're waiting for people to join and before we go on to the main Q&A, I thought it would be really good to actually talk about the trees that were near us when we grew up, because I know we talked about this, and that, I remember the trees from my childhood, and I think they were really important in turning me into somebody who wanted to work on the science behind our trees. And I know we both grew up in cities on opposite sides of the ocean. So I grew up in Manchester, in the north of England, and in quite a suburban, not in a particularly green part, but there were these big, beautiful elm trees all along the street that I lived on. And when we were kids, our whole life revolved around these elm trees. We played games, hide and seek behind them, and we invented this whole world where people lived in the bark, like you do when you're a child. And then when I was about 10, like a lot of trees in the UK, they got Dutch elm disease. And I remember really clearly the whole street having to be felled in one go. And suddenly these trees were kind of gone from my life. So I remember those trees really clearly from when I was a child. But what trees were... You grew up in a very different place.
Yeah, so mine is the tropical forest. I am from Bogota, and I grew up in Bogota. And they're my absolute favorite tree is the jarumo tree, which the scientific name is Cecropia peltata. And it's something that really connects me to home. Whenever I'm in Colombia, whenever I see a jarumo, it connects me to what I'm doing. It reminds me of why I love nature so much and how important it is to protect trees and ecosystems. So it's been something that has been connecting me to this sector and this field of work since I was very, very young. So it has a very personal meaning, but professional meaning to me. It's a great memory that I have whenever I see a jarumo tree.
Are they really big trees, or are they small?
Yeah, they're massive trees. They can have like green leaves or silver leaves. So they can call them like the white jarumo or silver jarumo, which is beautiful. And sometimes they call it like the bear claw because they look like a real club. They're massive.
Because they have
So,
five
Yeah,
individual leaves,
they have
don't
like big ones. So yeah, it's a great one. It's a great memory for me.
Yeah, I think, and share your memories of the trees that were around you when you were a child in the chat. We'd love to hear about more trees from your childhood. So we really want to thank you for all your thoughts and questions. So lots of you over the past few months have shown how deeply that you care about the trees and forests in your lives and these issues that we're talking about. So we're gonna dive in and talk a little bit about the big COP going on at the moment, I think, aren't we?
Which, may I say, Mary has bravely just arrived from COP. She just landed from a plane here, so we're very grateful to have her. And you have all of the insights. Yes, you have all of the insights from COP, so we're very much looking forward to hear how it was and all of the events that happened around COP.
And so trees and forests were a very big part of this COP. I should say it's still going on. Very often the scientists tend to leave before the whole conference finishes because that's when the real negotiations ramp up, and will be our friends who are in the negotiation teams will not be getting a lot of sleep over the next few nights. A big shout out and hello to them and lots of love because they're still working very hard. So WWF's key asks for global leaders and businesses at this COP was to really secure the end of deforestation, because something really big happened. Some of you who followed Glasgow COP that was in the UK 2 years ago will probably remember this, that there was this big commitment called the Glasgow Leaders Declaration to commit to end deforestation, to halt it and reverse it by 2030. And actually, in relation to the work that you do, Veronica, there was quite an exciting announcement in relation to deforestation and conversion-free action at COP as well, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a great news that the UK government, through the DEFRA department, announced some additional details on the UK due diligence regulation on forest risk commodities. So there are 2 points that we wanted to highlight on this due diligence regulation, because it's been much waited for everybody. We were expecting to listen to what the UK government had to say about this. And so the forest risk commodities scheme will be introduced through the provisions of Schedule 17 in the Environment Act in 2021. And the secondary legislation is meant to operationalize those provisions in the next parliamentary times. And we got some more information on the full list of commodities and the commodities in scope, which will be non-dairy cattle products, so beef and leather, cocoa, palm, and soy. And this regulation is really critical because WWF has estimated that between 2016 and 2018, around 21 million hectares, so roughly the area almost the size of the UK, was required each year to meet UK demand for 7 forest risk commodities alone. So this is absolutely critical, and we are very keen and hopeful that the UK government can move ahead with the secondary legislation that we so much need to advance on this agenda.
So that would mean, essentially this was about ensuring that when we buy products in the UK, we can be confident that those products haven't been associated with illegal deforestation. Because I think for a lot of people, you might not be aware that you could be buying something, that could have been associated with land being cleared illegally overseas.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I wanted to ask you about another part of deforestation and conversion free as well, because that's the legislation that addresses illegal deforestation. But actually, there's a bigger issue as well, isn't there, that I know a lot of your work is on, because at the moment a lot of our trade and a lot of our financial and subsidy systems actually support the conversion of forest to grow food. But so do you want to tell us a little bit more about that issue, so the legal deforestation and what sort of work we're doing to try and ensure, because really we need all deforestation to stop ultimately, don't we?
Yes, and I think as WWF we've been working a lot on reviewing and assessing the EU due diligence legislation, which is as well very relevant in this space, and it's covering both illegal and legal deforestation, mainly because of what Mary just explained. So we are hoping, or we are identifying that the UK due diligence legislation, as it is, it's only covering illegal deforestation. So there is a loophole to be addressed, and we need to assess ways on how to then identify those legal ways of clear and deforest land. Because at the moment, in many of the producing countries, it's not so easy to tell when deforestation is illegal or legal, or many of the legal frameworks or regulations that are in place in those producing countries are sometimes incentivizing deforestation or do not have the strong, robust frameworks that we need. So it is something that we need to be mindful of, and it's something that the organization has been flagging. And we do at the end need a full scope of legal and illegal deforestation to be covered in these kinds of regulations and frameworks.
I know one of the things we looked at in Pathways as well that I know was a big number, a big realization actually, that the amount of forest positive funding that we put in, so funding that helps us to protect and to restore forests, is vastly outweighed by this massive amount of precisely the kinds of subsidies that you were talking about that incentivize the conversion of forest, and it's at least 100 times more funding goes into those activities. So really big reforms needed to, it's our whole way of our whole food system really that comes into play when we think about these forest issues. So I really enjoyed hearing about the trees of your childhood, but we should start and move on to some of these questions. So hi again, if you are just joining us, you have joined the WWF Expert Q&A on how can we protect and restore our forests. And we're going to move on, I think. I think you've got the first question. I'm going to stop talking.
No worries. No. I'm going to start the questions, and Mary, as one of the leading authors of the Forest Pathways report, we're very keen for her to answer some questions that we have. So let's get started.
Give me a chance to talk about forests and talk all day.
Let's do it. So I wanted to ask you, by asking how can we restore the forest, we are implying that forests around the world are not in the best shape.
Right.
So if we look at the snapshot of the state of the forest and the current state of the forest, what do we see?
Yeah, I mean, there's really no other way to say it than when we look at the kind of state of play and where we are, our forests are not in great shape. And particularly when we look at where we are in terms of making progress towards meeting those 2030 goals, to do two really big things. First of all, actually halting deforestation, and then giving nature space to recover and restore what we've lost. And even just taking the values of forest loss from 2022, so when we launched our big Forest Pathways report, we co-launched with a global assessment that happens every year called the Forest Declaration Assessment. So the Forest Declaration Assessment every year look quantitatively across the planet and say how much forest have we lost, where is forest coming back, and how are we tracking progress towards that 2030 goal. So just in 2022, we lost 6.6 million hectares of forest, and critically that primary tropical forest loss. So our tropical forests are one of the most important forest types on the planet. They're where this huge amount of carbon gets stored. They're critical for stabilizing the whole climate of our planet, the amounts of water that move through their forest. They're critical for the peoples who live in those forests and depend on them, and also support a huge amount of nature and biodiversity. So those super precious primary tropical forests, we lost 4.1 million hectares, an area the size of Denmark in just 1 year. So the position when we started that report was to say, look, we're just not making progress at the pace and the scale that we need to. And critically, the loss of that super irreplaceable primary tropical forest is way bigger than it needs to be. Mm-hmm. And the real challenge is every year between now and 2030 that we don't make progress, the targets for the next year are harder to reach because we've got to reduce deforestation even more. So I guess that was the kind of starting place for our report, really, wasn't it? To say, what position are we in, and how do we have conversations about getting into a better place so that we're not seeing those terrible results year on year.
Yeah, what I liked as well about the report is that it's solution driven and action driven. So although it does mention the current state of the forest, what I really like about this report, it goes a step beyond to say, okay, what's needed then? What are the solutions that we're proposing? What are the things that we're looking in the ground that are working? So we also have some hope on what's coming up, because otherwise the picture is quite bleak and it can be very depressing. So I like the balance that the report has managed.
Yeah. And we always describe forest pathways as that we were trying to derive a blueprint, green print maybe, of where we go from here.
Yeah.
But before we move on to, as usual, we're going to get the glue. I can see someone waving a piece of paper at me, and I'm not very subtly going to do that to take it. So, yeah, before we move on to the kind of stories of hope and restoration, which, like you say, are super important because they are out there. There's some amazing forest positive work going on around the world. Do you want to take us through the gloom? Take us through the global threats our forests are facing right now?
Yes. So just to set the scene before talking about the threats, I just wanted to mention the value of forests. So forests are home to 47 million people. They are directly generating over 250 billion in economic activity each year, and their estimated value is 150 trillion US dollars. So it's the double of the total value of global stocks. However, they're very impacted, as you know, by climate change, by deforestation, by degradation. And across the world, we're seeing so much damage, mainly through climate change. So climate change, as many organizations and many stakeholders across the world have been flagging for several years, is the most serious threat to forests and ecosystems in the medium term. And Mary has mentioned already some of the impacts, including wildfire systems, increase in those extreme weather events, hotter drought, pest, disease. But these are also challenges that are linked to underlying causes of deforestation. And those ones, I think, are the ones that are very detailedly explained in the report. Mainly agriculture. So not surprisingly, agriculture is by far the largest driver of tropical deforestation across the world. Food consumption has risen twice as fast as the global population over the past 20 years.
Sorry, go over that one for me again. So the amount of food that we consume has gone up twice as fast as the global population. Wow.
That's massive. And exactly, there's so much production happening. And the environmental regulation, environmental criteria, the sustainability conditions are not yet there in place to make sure that it's a sustainable production and consumption pattern. And soy, cattle, and palm oil are often quoted as the top 3 commodity drivers of forest and ecosystem loss, which is why WWF is making so much effort in those commodities as well as other commodities, but has a massive amount of work throughout the network to address many of the issues that's happening in those commodities. One that's massive is land grabbing, and for me as a Colombian, land grabbing is the main deforestation.
What does that mean? That might not, if that maybe isn't a term that people are familiar with. What does land grabbing mean?
So land grabbing is land clearing, so clearing a piece of land or a land clear system in order to, it could be to expand the agricultural frontier, it could be to establish a production model, so a cattle ranching system or a livestock system or a crop. But it also, and we've seen that through many of the regions that are facing land grabbing issues, it can also be a way for illegal groups to disguise a lot of the actions that they are attempting to do. So either if it is through corruption systems or money laundering, land grabbing has become a way to gain territorial control in many of the communities where the land has been cleared, or to just maintain and continue illicit activities through that system. So it's quite a complex one. Yeah. It's one that we keep assessing and analyzing in the different areas of the world because it requires a very complex and comprehensive way of tackling it.
I guess it changes
and it changes
over time
exactly.
And space as well.
And context. So, but it is one that's absolutely key for us to keep in mind. And then others that of course have been flagged constantly are illegal and legal ways of mining, infrastructure development, and illegal and legal ways of logging, because sometimes we forget about the legal logging, but many of the areas are sometimes cleared for commercial production of trees that are just simply not meant to be there in the first place.
I think it's really interesting, Veronica, when you talk about this as well, because it really brings it really reminds me of one of the key issues that we looked at in a broader perspective with the Pathways report, that a lot of these really entrenched systems basically just don't recognise the value of standing forest to the indigenous peoples and to the local communities who depend on them, to the wildlife, to the nature services, all of those things that really, when the forest is removed, nobody ever pays that invoice. Mm-hmm. The land is valued more highly for growing crops or for the illicit activities that it's involved in, or for the minerals in the ground beneath the forest. So we really have this entrenched system where that total value of the forest to all of the people and nature and the climate delivery of that stored carbon and everything that the forest does just isn't seen. And it's going to take a really big change for us to shift to a value system where the forest is seen for all of its different values rather than the commodity that it could produce by growing a crop or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that was a really big theme that ran through the report.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think once we value the standing forest in a sustainable way, but also in a way that can compete with the other economies, that's where it's going to be starting to shift the dynamics. Because as you say, we're not really valuing standing forest the same way we're valuing clear lands.
Mm. And actually, speaking of wanting to be hopeful, that gives me a reminder actually to talk about two really positive things that have happened at COP. We're starting to see really great and innovative ideas for funding standing forest. Mm-hmm. There were quite a lot that emerged over the last couple of weeks at COP, and also very, very hot off the press. I think the last update on the global stock take was literally 2 hours ago, and food systems is mentioned. So it's really nice to be able to see some positive elements there. Mm-hmm. So I'm holding in my hand a question that we've received, and I will quickly try and answer this. So we've had a really, really superb and thoughtful question. What is the current rate of deforestation versus restoration? So I guess somebody, thank you, whoever posted this question, asking, is this negative, or can we say it's positive? Are we restoring more than we're losing? Unfortunately, we are not yet restoring what we are losing, but there are places where forest is recovering both through natural regeneration and where through active restoration. So that could include replanting trees, or actually just giving space for trees to grow back, to regenerate naturally. And we are seeing places where forests are coming back to life. Mm-hmm. So one of the amazing things about nature is that when it's given space, it does recover. So we're not quite there yet. We are still losing more than we're gaining, but there are certainly countries in the world, a lot of countries in the world actually, that are reducing their deforestation targets and are restoring what they've lost. So we do have pockets of hope, which segues us beautifully into talking about ways forwards for our forest, I guess.
Yes, perfect. So on our way forward for forest, we know we have this incredible blueprint that tells global leaders, businesses, and people how to bring forest back to life. Is there anything that you think is worth highlighting here on that pathway of hope, on what we can do and that call to action? Yeah, absolutely. So you will remember, having written it and been on our author team with us, that we kind of highlighted these three really key things that absolutely have to happen if we are going to make progress towards those twin goals, those critical lines in the forest of halting deforestation and restoring what we've lost. And I'm going to loop back on the first one to what we talked about with that huge mismatch between negative and positive forest funding. We've got to see halting of harmful finances, so funding that pays to convert forest unsustainably and causes harm, and some of those subsidies being converted and repurposed to fund standing forests and to fund, what's really important as well is to fund forested nations to make those transitions in trade systems that we know can happen to sustainable forest economies. Kind of sitting above all of those, one of the huge conclusions of the report was that we've got to see broader delivery of rights to Indigenous peoples and local communities who live in and who depend on forests all around the globe. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that before I move on, Veronica, because you know far better than me that whilst that is a rights and a justice issue, it comes down to climate justice. But with a science hat on,
we also know when scientists look at how our forests are doing around the globe, the tropical forests that are doing best are those that are in indigenous territories under the stewardship of people. So deforestation rates are lower, rates of degradation are lower across the tropics and indigenous territories. So sitting above as an umbrella over all of these different recommendations is that delivery of secure and realised rights for indigenous peoples and local communities in forests around the globe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have a final question before we wrap up. So they're asking us, we had a suggestion to plant trees immediately everywhere. Is that the answer? I would say depends. Depends where, depends how, depends. Yeah, I wouldn't say everywhere is the answer. It really depends where you do it and how you do it. So
I think, this is something that I hear a lot. We all want to be told what's the one thing? What's the one thing we can do? And as humans, all of us, we would rather have a simple answer. And I think for a long time, we were told, let's just plant. But actually what we know now is we have to plant the right tree in the right place for the right reasons. There are some places where trees don't grow naturally. Grasslands, all of these other habitats and ecosystems are critically important. So we don't want to just have trees being planted everywhere across the planet. One of the things that we think about when we think about how our climate works with forests from above are actually really dark. So if we plant forest in parts of the planet which from above are pale, the vegetation on the land surface is pale, which helps to reflect heat to space, we would enhance global warming even further. So actually we could make some really big mistakes if we adopted plant trees immediately everywhere.
So plant trees, yes, but do know where and how. Immediately, yes, again, where, how, and everywhere, no. I think it really depends on the area.
And it's about giving trees space to recover where they would be naturally, and then assisting that restoration and that recovery where we can. So again, it's one of those things where it's a little bit more complicated than we would all rather have naturally. We would like a simple answer of let's just frantically plant everywhere, but we know that actually doesn't help us to stabilise our climate and restore nature if we don't get our planting right.
Yeah.
But that's a great question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest segue, just to end this on a reminder on the deforestation and conversion-free agenda of this commodity supply chain issues, because it's not only about forest, it's about other natural ecosystems. And it's critical that we maintain and we keep this in the narratives when discussing about these issues at the global level. So I think it is a great question for us to then say, we also need to ensure that those other natural ecosystems and non-wooded lands are covered into the narratives and the agendas that are discussing this great issue in the international forest.
And particularly so important in the Amazon region, where we know we've heard some real progress with deforestation rates coming down in some ecosystems, but then going up massively in other types of ecosystems, the Cerrado, the savanna types. So when I hear this word, Veronica, it reminds me of how unbelievably difficult your job is. What we need to do is make sure that when we halt deforestation in one area, it doesn't just spill over to another area. It must feel like you're chasing constantly to try and make sure that you don't get that spillage, as it's referred to, into other biomes. Not a simple problem.
The puzzle, which again is shown in the report, I think it's a great way to understand how to address the issue.
Yeah. So I guess we are just about out of time. So I'm going to thank you all. Thank you to everybody who tuned in and submitted questions today. We've really, really enjoyed reading your questions and your comments. And we really hope that we leave you a bit more hopeful about the future of our forests. We do, like Veronica said, we do know what we need to do. We do have ways to move forward. And we have examples of places where forests are being brought back to life around the world, and we're seeing the recovery of nature and the recovery of those beautiful forest ecosystems. Yeah. So if you would like to catch up on this Q&A, it will be available to rewatch on both YouTube and Instagram, where you can also find regular updates on the vital work that we carry out to bring our world back to life. Thank you so much.